Hello, welcome everyone to our second spring webinar on behalf of the Center for Mexican Studies. I would like to do a land acknowledgement first. The Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga people. Thank you for all those joining us um, virtually in YouTube. Uh, we're continuing our discussion about issues of Mexico. The last time we had a discussion about challenges facing the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement negotiations. And now we're going to go back in history. And we have the great pleasure to have Professor Peter Guardino with us. Professor Guardino is the Bernardo Mendel Chair in Latin American History and Provost Professor in the history department at Indiana University at Bloomington. So let me read a little bit of the long biography, of course, and accomplishments of Professor Guardino before giving him the floor. Professor Guardino's work focuses on Mexico's impoverished majorities in the second half of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century. He's interested in social movements, state formation, nationalism, and popular political culture in 18th and 19th century Mexico. He teaches graduate courses on colonial history, nationalism, and social movements, as well as a variety of undergraduate courses on Mexico, modern and colonial Latin America, world history, and war. And today he's with us with a wonderful presentation that he has titled Nature Overturned, Race Revolution and Political Conflict in Mexico, 1780 through 1835. So looking forward to hear his presentation and this idea about racial hierarchy and the fight for equality early on until the arrival of President Vicente Guerrero. So um, please help me welcome Professor Guardino, and the floor is yours. Please take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Before I begin the actual presentation, I want to take a moment to thank UCLA and especially Brian Pitts, Assistant Director of its Latin American Institute, and Gaspar Rivera Salgado, Director of the Center for Mexican Studies, for allowing me this opportunity. UCLA has a really long and fantastic record of support for studies of Mexico, going back more than a century, and this makes this a very apt place to present some of my work. Okay, so we're going to go prime time now. In his April 1829 inaugural address, Vicente Guerrero, Mexico's second president, stated that in Mexico's federal republic, all men were citizens who could vote and hold political office. At first glance, the passage may seem like a political rhetoric with little relevance for most Mexicans. Its power is revealed when we think about what Mexico had been like before. In colonial Mexico, authority had been concentrated in the hands of wealthy, well-placed white people with close family and cultural ties to Spain. Every Mexican was classified by race and placed on a racial hierarchy in which the vast majority of Mexicans were confined to the lowest rungs. The fact that an Afro-Mexican held the nation's most prestigious political office showed emphatically that much had changed. Considered in historical context, Guerrero's statement is very radical. Independent Mexico was unusual. It abolished racial categories, completely rejecting the racism which colonialism had relied on to organize society. Yet Mexico took equality even further than that. It set up a representative government in which all men were allowed to vote, regardless of both race and income. And they voted. Thousands of poor, dark-skinned Mexicans thronged the polling places in cities and some rural areas. This political egalitarianism has been mostly overlooked because the effort to build a democratic political system failed. By 1829, armed force had come to determine who held power. This drew historians' attention away from the way ordinary Mexicans embraced the remarkable ideals of Mexican laws and constitutions. They instead focused on the complicated jockeying of interest groups and politicians. However, The egalitarianism expressed in laws, constitutions, and political writing was not simply empty rhetoric. It was important to the political mobilization of hundreds of thousands of people. It terrified Mexican elites, sparking a fierce and violent reaction. Representative government collapsed because it was unable to handle the passionate hopes that political equality inspired in some kinds of people and the dark fears that it provoked in other kinds of people. The strength of those hopes and fears is difficult for us to understand because we take for granted the fact that today nominal equality among people does not prevent the wealthy from dominating everyone else. What we have to understand, though, is that in colonial Mexico, the official racial hierarchy coincided quite closely with the real distribution of power in everyday life. This made it reasonable for both poor, dark-skinned people and the elite to believe that eliminating the official racial hierarchy would drastically change society. In 1810, Mexico was ruled by officials appointed by the Spanish king, and most of them were men born in Spain. Extremely wealthy families in New Spain included people born in the New World, but they considered themselves to be Spaniards. These great families continually renewed their connection to Spain by bringing over relatives from Spain and then marrying them to their young women. These great families held vast wealth, balancing interests in different areas. One was silver mining, which was capital intensive and risky, but could yield great wealth. Another was international commerce, where they imported manufactured products from Spain and distributed them in Mexico. The third was agriculture, especially large estates in areas that were particularly profitable because they were close to mining centers or other cities. The great families concentrated enormous wealth, and they believed that they, together with Spanish bureaucrats, held a monopoly on honor and status. The elite families believed that most people outside their families had some African ancestry, and they were committed to maintaining a strict racial hierarchy in which they were at the top of the social order. These were the people who commissioned the famous casta paintings, which purported to provide a sort of visual chart of the different groups one encountered in society, attributing characteristics to each. Each casta painting consisted of a series of scenes arranged in hierarchical order. Each scene depicted two parents with different racial identities and a child who was the product of their union. The paintings provided specific terms for each racial mixture, and to do this, they used a far greater number of specific terms than were seen in any other source for the period. These paintings draw the eye with extremely detailed scenes. They show variations of clothing, tools, merchandise for sale, and of course, skin color. Many scenes seem to depict relatively humble people in their daily lives, and it is easy to be distracted by the social detail that is so rarely captured in textual documents. However, the paintings only seem to be realistic. They offer better evidence of the preoccupations of elites than they do of the daily lives of ordinary Mexicans. The painting signaled a hierarchy in which greater whiteness was linked to higher economic and social status. When they commissioned casta paintings, wealthy whites were buying visual confirmation of their social status. They sought not a realistic depiction of life in New Spain, but instead a reassuring fiction. Most people depicted were of mixed blood, and the less white blood they had, the more manual their occupation and the more ragged their clothes. The paintings bring us to one of the most counterintuitive things that we have to comprehend about the period. Mexican intellectuals have long seen Mexico as a mestizo nation, and the eruption of explicitly indigenous political movements in the 1990s was a crucial reminder that indigenous groups are still an important and exploited part of Mexico's population. In the colonial period, most people were indigenous, and the colonial elite both exploited indigenous people and feared them. However, they were much more preoccupied with people of African descent, and the threat posed was not so much social violence as it was the racial contamination of elite families. Slaves were not a huge part of the labor force. Most Black people have been released from slavery as population growth made it more profitable to higher wage laborers. This very freedom and the ways in which people of African descent intermarried with other groups worried the elites. The Spanish identifying elite did its utmost to hold itself aloof from these people because they believed that mixed race people carried the taint of African blood. Prussian traveler Alexander von Humboldt observed that, quote, The families reputed to have the least mixture of Negro or mulatto blood are also naturally the most honored. Maintaining a very strict separation from anyone who might have any African ancestry was hugely important to the Spanish identified elite because it helped them believe that they were superior to everyone else. Beneath the tiny strata of these leading families were many less wealthy people who had significant economic resources. People in these intermediate positions did not see themselves as rabble, but they also knew that the colonial system limited their economic security and social prestige. Some owned smaller firms with limited access to credit and markets. Others were small-scale merchants or parish priests. These people were in institutions where bad luck or bad decisions could put them on the road to actual poverty. The elite suspected them all of having some African ancestry. In the highly racialized social and cultural environment, no amount of hard work, intelligence, or honorable behavior would allow them to rise very far. Members of the elite routinely used the term mulatto as an insult, and men reputed to have African ancestry who tried to marry the daughters of wealthy whites were publicly rebuffed. Mixed-race people, regardless of their financial success or behavior, were constantly exposed to disdain. Racism was inescapable, a daily source of fear and frustration. People who were poor had it much worse. They were probably subject to more frequent insults, and their lives were precarious. The vast majority grew crops based on Mexico's seasonal rains, with no way to irrigate their fields if rain was scarce. Lack of capital and high transport costs kept them from benefiting from the capitalistic, market-oriented side of the economy. The lives of the urban poor were also precarious. Most men did not have steady employment. Market women, artisans, and porters fed themselves with the money they earned daily, and probably many did not even stay a day or two ahead of their empty stomachs. The elite deeply disdained dark-skinned, ragged men looking for work on city streets, seeing them as dirty, lazy, and criminal. They called these men lepers. Mixed race and indigenous families of middling resources struggled to build wealth and avoid poverty. Their less wealthy counterparts were even less secure, skirting the edge of economic disaster and sometimes falling off with lethal consequences for their children. The microaggressions that came with the caste system made the social hierarchy psychologically inescapable for everyone. Nevertheless, mixed race people did not share the elite's obsession with race. When deciding who to do business with, who to work with, and who to live with, and who to marry, the poor cared more about character, work ethic, and skills than racial category. People who the system had sorted into different castes worked together in the same businesses, and they lived in the same neighborhoods and even the same houses. People chose individuals whose caste category differed from theirs to serve in the most intimate and important roles in their lives, naming them as the godparents of their children or the executors of their wills. The strongest evidence of this comes in marriages. Marriage records show that although the white elite maintained a tenacious endogamy, people from other groups routinely married across the supposedly rigid barriers of caste. The evidence strongly indicates that people did not share the elite's obsession with the caste system. The Spanish identified elite believed that its members were the only people in colonial society capable of having honor. The rest of society believed that honor derived from behavior, not birth. Honest, pious people who worked hard and supported their families had honor. Between 1810 and 1821, New Spain was racked by violence that dramatically weakened the economy and killed a large fraction of the population. Calling this Mexico's War of Independence is both revealing and misleading. It is revealing because the war resulted in Mexico becoming independent. Yet it is also misleading. For most people, the crucial outcome of the war was not Mexican sovereignty so much as it was the rejection of colonial social categories. Social egalitarianism was a defining characteristic of the rebel platform long before they openly sought independence. That rejection of colonial categories and forms of subordination took different forms. Insurgent leaders proclaimed the abolition of tribute, slavery, and the caste system. For 10 years, the rebels vilified and persecuted Spaniards, typically identified by the pejorative term gachupines. Many of the individuals who collected rents, decided on prices, and made loans to impoverished rural and urban people were Spaniards, men who had arrived from Spain to make their fortunes. Many tribute collectors were also Spaniards. These Spaniards were the sharp end of the colonial stick, the point that actually caused pain for poor people. In 1808, when Napoleon kidnapped the royal family and tried to make his brother king of Spain and the Spanish Empire, the widespread fear and political uncertainty in New Spain opened up an opportunity for regional elites with middling resources, people the elite often assumed were of mixed race. Some sought more autonomy from Spain, others sought independence, but all chafed at their own subordination to the great families. The rebellion relied on mobilizing poor rural people into an explicitly egalitarian anti-colonial politics. The rebel leaders committed to radical egalitarian reforms from the first moments of the rebellion. They repeated them on numerous occasions, and when a negotiated end to the war became possible in 1821, egalitarianism was the only condition they insisted upon. In 1813, Jose Maria Morelos issued one of the most colorful statements. He proclaimed the abolition of, quote, the very beautiful gibberish of the qualities of Indian, mulatto, or mestizo suspended in air, etc. The sarcasm is palpable as he insisted that racial hierarchy was literally meaningless. Tension in el aire, suspended in air, was one of those terms that we find only in the Costa paintings. Most likely, Morelos was referencing the paintings, taking direct aim at the racial views of the leading families. The Spanish identifying elite must have felt like it was aimed directly at them. The insurgents also abolished tribute, a tax paid only by indigenous people and people of African descent, a sign of their racial subordination. They called for the abolition of slavery. Slavery was a key root of the prejudice against people of African descent. Often, documents grouped the end of slavery, the end of tribute, and the end of the caste system together. For instance, Morelos' November 1810 decree abolishing slavery read, with the exception of the European Spaniards, everyone else will not be called Indians, mulattoes, or other castes, but instead all will be called Americans. No one will pay tribute. There will be no more slavery, and all who own slaves will be punished. The rebels physically attacked Spanish people. The poor were diverse in their geographic situation, diverse in their ethnic or racial composition, and diverse in the ways they struggled to make a living. But their hatred of the men born in Spain united them across all these differences. The killings of Gachupines took place on haciendas, in small indigenous villages, and in large cities. Some of the emotional power behind anti-Spanish words and deeds stem from the belief that Spaniards disdained most of the people they interacted with in Mexico. Many of the economic forces that were pressing families actually impacted them through the interactions with Spaniards. One anonymous and undated insurgent document, for instance, stated of the Spaniards that, quote, face to face with the most helpless poor person and even the greatest public disasters, they feel nothing. They only want to fatten their wealth, extracting the blood of the poor like leeches with their usurious monopolies and frauds. Ironically, the ruling families of Mexico also felt threatened from the center of the empire. To make a long story short, in Spain, the resistance to Napoleon was led by Spanish liberals who wrote a radically egalitarian constitution. Elections would be held not only in Spain, but throughout the Spanish Empire, and suffrage was extended to all men who did not have any African ancestry. Spanish liberals hoped to moderate the power of ordinary people by making elections indirect. However, in a Mexico racked by Revolutionary War, urban elections quickly became a referendum on the insurgency itself, as pro-insurgent groups organized the urban poor to vote. Spanish liberals, the rebels, and royalist military forces all mobilized large numbers of people into politics during the 18 teens. After the major rebel armies were defeated, guerrilla groups continued to fight for years. When the Spanish royal family returned to power in Spain, the king abolished the new constitution and restored absolutist rule, but the war in Mexico ground on. In 1820, liberal military officers forced the king to reinstate the constitution. Authorities in Mexico instructed royalist military leaders to tell the rebels that the Spanish Constitution offered them what they wanted. However, the Constitution did not automatically confer citizenship on people who had African ancestors. This effectively disqualified many of the rebels. When the royalist military contacted the most important guerrilla leader, Vicente Guerrero, he replied, "How can I show my face in my patria in which I do not have the right to be a citizen?" Later, the royalist general Agustin de Iturbide approached Guerrero with a different goal. He wanted to form an alliance to make Mexico independent. Guerrero insisted that he would not cooperate unless all Mexicans, regardless of race, would be citizens. The resulting Plan de Iguala, under which Mexico became independent, states that all inhabitants, without any distinction except their merit and virtues, are citizens. By the end of 1821, Mexico was independent. What, though, had really changed? Wealth was still distributed very unequally. Most Mexicans continued to work extremely hard to scratch out a living. The revolution had definitely not overthrown the economic order. For this reason, the prevalent view in the historiography for many years was that there had been little change in politics beyond a transfer of political power from the colonial government to wealthy Mexicans. Unfortunately for the Spanish identifying elite, this was not really true. Instead, they struggled to grasp political power. In the 1820s, the wealthy knew that they had landed in a fluid situation with very radical possibilities, and many feared that events could quickly accelerate out of control, imitating the frightening examples of the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution. In the words of Scottish-American emigre William McClure, they felt the society was now, quote, on the crater of an active volcano, liable to be blown to atoms. The Plan de Iguala had officially extended citizenship to all Mexicans. Racial equality was an unusual and extremely radical move in the world of the moment. Although abolitionist sentiment was important in Great Britain and France, only some abolitionists advocated such radical racial equality. Moreover, in the United States, racial inequality was growing, not receding. Yet Mexico was no racial utopia. Declaring that all Mexicans, regardless of race, were equal citizens did not eliminate centuries of colonial racial prejudice. The very wealthiest extended families continued to disdain those who were less wealthy and less white. In Mexico, elections were folded into an ongoing social and racial conflict. Politicians were trying to establish governments legitimated by universal male suffrage in a very unequal society traumatized by 10 years of social war. In many places, that war had destroyed the economic ties that might have allowed elites to use patronage to control politics. The war had crippled some colonial forms of social control, opened fundamental issues about society up to debate, and brought many more people into politics. Political stability was the least likely outcome. Race was central to the conflicts that defined Mexican politics in the 1820s. In colonial society, economic exploitation and social hierarchy had been justified on the basis of natural racial differences. The violence of the war and the abolition of racial categories pulled the rug out from under that. The elite could no longer openly claim that their privileged position was a natural result of their racial superiority. Wealthy Mexicans could not openly use racial terms in their political discourse, but they also could not erase race from their minds. Elections were crucial to conflict, even though they rarely determined who actually held political office. This is counterintuitive. If elections did not determine who held power, why were they crucial? For one thing, they mobilized many people, especially in urban areas. Regularly calling people to the polls encouraged them to see themselves as political actors, to imagine that their problems might have political solutions, and to believe that their nominal political equality might improve their opportunities. It also made them willing to join demonstrations and civil wars. The very act of voting was seen as evidence that the dark-skinned poor were honorable and valuable. Elections were publicly visible manifestations of egalitarianism. They were moments in which the Spanish identifying elite had egalitarianism rubbed in their faces, and they did not like this at all. Scottish-American immigrant William McClure compared what he saw in Mexico City to what he had earlier witnessed in Paris during the French Revolution. McClure wrote that he was reminded, quote, of Paris during the French Revolution by the crowds in the streets assembling in clusters, reading the different proclamations, news, or decrees stuck upon the walls, or procuring the various pamphlets, sheets, and publications hawked about for sale. Wealthy Mexicans did not believe that Mexico's impoverished, dark-skinned masses were capable of reasoned political action, and they believed that letting the poor vote would lead inevitably to anarchy. The Spanish identifying elite often ridiculed poor, dark-skinned people who came to positions of authority they never would have been allowed to occupy under colonialism. They believed that these people were out of their natural place. In December 1827, Carlos Maria de Bustamante wrote that a black man who was asked to run for election to Mexico City's city council responded that he was a servant and he could not be a master. The story is probably apocryphal, but it says an enormous amount about the attitudes of the elite. Servants could not be masters, especially if they were black. This very open disdain showed the poor that the sense of honor and prestige they had gained from being named citizens was very contested. No one in Mexican politics attracted more racial vindictiveness than Vicente Guerrero. Guerrero's prominence made him a lightning rod for racial prejudice and slurs, ultimately costing him his life. Guerrero had African and possibly indigenous ancestors. He joined the Independence Rebellion and eventually became the most prominent of the surviving insurgent leaders. As we saw, this led to his pact with Iturbide when he insisted on political equality for people of African descent. During the 1820s, Guerrero was the standard bearer for Mexicans who linked patriotism to egalitarianism, eventually becoming president in 1829. As Guerrero climbed in Mexican politics, Mexico's wealthy elite squirmed. He was not their type of person in every way it was possible to not be their type of person. He was rural. He was a dark-skinned man with kinky hair. He did not have a formal education, and he strongly believed in the kind of equality that they hated. Guerrero's opponents tagged him with the negative traits that the elite had traditionally assigned to people with African descent. They called him immoral, barbarous, and uncivilized, and they accused him of being a womanizer. His ally, Lorenzo de Zavala, wrote of Guerrero that people with pretensions of culture or civilization detested the presidency of a man who was not white and could not mix in the circles of beautiful society with the ease that education and habit give. The married women of a certain class could not tolerate or see without spite and jealousy a family of a darker color occupying a distinguished place among them. Carlos Maria de Bustamante insulted Guerrero's family. He called them orangutan monkeys not worthy of governing a herd of pigs. If I have lingered on these insults and offended by quoting Bustamante's ugly words, it is because we need to ponder a question. What kinds of words were being murmured about ordinary Mexicans of mixed race and dark skin? What was the vibe that such men and women experienced when they encountered wealthy white Mexicans in the streets? What kind of eye contact was made or not made? What did it feel like? There is some evidence in judicial cases. In 1825, the priest Juan Simón de Ardo was riding with Juan Evangelista de Ardo, a younger man who the priest claimed was his nephew. Francisco Rangel refused to doff his hat as the priest rode by, and this enraged the priest. He began hitting Rangel with a stick he had been using to whip his mule, and he ordered Juan Evangelista to hit Rangel with his belt. When all the parties were brought before the judge Martin de Mier, the priest added fuel to the fire by saying, quote, "That little black is lying, ese negrito miente." The judge scolded the priest, pointing out that Rangel was a citizen with rights and that in independent Mexico, there is no longer despotism. The urban poor turned out in large numbers for elections, even after coups and civil wars became more important in determining who held office, because the right to vote had become a symbol of the ways in which the new system had elevated the poor and the dark-skinned to equal status. Voters arrived with their friends and families at the polls, insisting that they were citizens like everyone else. Mountains of newspapers, broadsides, and pamphlets circulated throughout Mexico. The voices of vendors hawking pamphlets and newspapers reached the ears of the illiterate. Men read the pamphlets and newspapers aloud in cafes and taverns, on corners and under the arches that surrounded the public squares, and in informal meetings of artisans. People discussed politics not only in the famous Masonic Lodge meetings, but also in theaters, at public markets, in cafes, in the pulquerias where poor people drank their favorite alcoholic beverage, in stores where they made everyday purchases and perhaps bought a little bit of rum to make the day go smoother, in pharmacies, at cockfights and bullfights, in restaurants and inns, and at family gatherings. In many different Mexican locales, the 1820s saw the emergence of a political division between people who advocated egalitarianism and those who defended social and political hierarchies. The establishment of York Rite Masonic lodges and the campaign against people born in Spain allowed these local struggles to be knit together into an alliance that could exert power on the national level. The written materials let people involved in local struggles place their own conflicts in a larger framework, one that assured them that they had allies, and one that made those local struggles seem more consequential. The surge of the York Rite Masonic lodges drove an increase in electoral participation, especially in urban areas. The Yorkinos deployed effective electoral propaganda, criticizing the continued importance of the Spaniards in politics and arguing stridently that Spaniards residing in Mexico threatened Mexico's independence. The Yorkinos developed urban campaign tactics that marshaled voters and armed them with lists of candidates. The radical Yorkinos also argued that citizens should petition and protest. This led to various kinds of armed demonstrations, including demonstrations demanding that the Spaniards be expelled from Mexico or demanding that specific officials be removed from office. The Yorkinos hated the idea that some were born to rule and others to follow. They saw their political opponents as aristocrats and the wealthy. In 1828, the Yorkino newspaper El Amigo del Pueblo explained the attitude of the wealthy as a reaction to the psychological damage egalitarianism had inflicted on the elite, saying that with the end of the old order, privileges disappear, equality is sanctioned, and the post of honor, no longer property of the privileged, become the prize of the meritorious and the virtuous. The vassal becomes the sovereign. Those who earlier received laws now give them. And the few men who believe that they were born to dominate are seen lost in the crowd and made to aspire only to what they know or can deserve. It is very logical that to them everything appears entirely new, without the attraction that the old ways had for them. They do not see anything as orderly or regular, because nothing conforms to their ideas, nor does it fit with their mode of thinking. It seems to them that nature itself has been overturned. The radical Yorkinos were convinced that their opponents wanted to return Mexico to Spanish rule. The logic seemed inescapable to them. Their opponents had prospered in the colonial period, monopolizing office holding, limiting opportunity for others, exploiting the poor, and using their whiteness as a cudgel to disparage anyone else. Why would they not want to return to Spanish rule when they had been dominant? One of the most striking things about the period is the heated conflict about men born in Spain. The Spaniards in Mexico were the subject of an astounding number of demonstrations, pamphlets, legislative debates, laws, and revolts. In 1827 alone, more than 12 states passed laws expelling the Spaniards, and the federal government passed similar laws in 1827, 1829, and 1833. Political passions about the Spaniards were intense and widespread. Thousands of people pressured the state and national legislatures, demonstrating and issuing proclamations, often with weapons in their hands. The debate about the Spanish dominated the period, and it allowed people to link patriotism with egalitarianism in ways that resonated emotionally with large numbers of lower and middle-class Mexicans. The historiography has not yet come to terms with how race shaped the way that ordinary Mexicans felt about the Spaniards living among them. Spanish immigrants had the reputation of being especially racist. The Spaniards were known for their haughtiness. Jose Maria Bocanegra wrote that anti-Spanish protests happened because the Spaniards continued operating, quote, with the pride and with that hardness that was generally used in the time of the viceregal government. This sense of superiority is implied in many documents. The impression one gets is that it was a constant source of friction and irritation that only sometimes yielded sparks bright enough to burn themselves into the documentary record. This makes sense. No one was recording haughty looks, cutting comments, and other kinds of microaggressions. There were only 10,000 Spaniards in a Mexico whose population reached 6.5 million. This demographically tiny group became central to political conflict. The Spaniards became a potent symbol of something that many ordinary Mexicans hated: the persistence of colonial racial prejudice against people of mixed race, and the idea that honor came from birth, not behavior, bothered many ordinary Mexicans. Anti-Spanish rhetoric usually stressed the idea that the Spaniards were disloyal to independent Mexico. However, I suspect that this rhetoric was a thinly masked way for them to criticize racial privilege and class distinction. Critics of the Spaniards said that they were a threat to, quote, our system. But what did they mean by our system? Was it independence or was it equality? In many states, ordinary Mexicans with weapons in their hands demanded the expulsion of the Spaniards. These movements became the training grounds for the 1828 revolt that would place Vicente Guerrero in the presidency. Anti-Spanish sentiment was expressed from Chihuahua in the north to Campeche in the south, and in Mexico City and no fewer than 17 of Mexico's current states. We often think of Mexico in the first half of the 19th century as a set of regions with diverse interests, diverse political coalitions, and diverse political cultures. The presence of anti-Spanish activity across such a huge geographic breadth, from the tropical coast to the cool altiplano, and from the arid north to the rainy south, shows that it was a movement with a truly national presence. The situation of the Spaniards was not helped by the fact that Spain's government persisted for years in the delusion that it was possible to reconquer Mexico. In 1829, it even sent an armed expedition to Tampico. The intransigence of the Spanish government stoked conspiracy theories and witch hunts against Spaniards in Mexico. As the 1828 presidential election drew closer, political life was dominated by competition between politicians who espoused the new egalitarian ideals and those who feared that those ideals had caused disorder. Those who campaigned against the Spaniards were egalitarians. They believed that to be a patriot, one had to support the new ideals. They also believed that their opponents favored a return to colonial-style hierarchies, or even a return to Spanish rule. The close connection these Spaniards drew between egalitarianism and patriotism increased the heat of political conflict and allowed them to build relationships with elite allies in many localities. Mexico was a very large and diverse place in which the growing tensions actually played out in political life in hundreds of local social spaces. The economic, social, and family lives of most people happened in those local spaces, and many historians have argued that this meant that national level political issues were meaningless abstractions for most poor people. However, often local politicians successfully drew ordinary people in quite isolated places into the grand drama of national politics by tying that drama to important local disputes. When we poke into political conflicts in different localities, we often see that two well-defined groups clashed repeatedly. Usually, one group saw itself as the respectable people of the area, relatively wealthy landowners, merchants, and sometimes priests. These respectable people often had ties with local Spaniards, and they believed that seedy politicians were stoking the anti-Spanish feelings of poor residents by frightening them about the possibility of reconquest and enticing them with the wealth of the Spaniards. In contrast, those politicians who opposed the Spaniards saw themselves as patriots, and many of their supporters were from the lower classes. The supporters of hierarchy often sought allies at the state or national levels among the Scotch Rite Masons, and later their successors, while those who espoused egalitarianism sought allies among the radical York Rite Masons. The growth of party politics, the deeply emotional issue of the Spaniards in Mexico, and the connections to local political conflicts in many regions of Mexico all fed into the closely fought 1828 presidential election. This election was a remarkable moment in Mexico's history in which questions of class and race were at the center of formal politics. It pitted former royalist officer Manuel Gomez Pedraza, a man widely believed to represent both stability and the oligarchy, against Vicente Guerrero, an Afro-Mexican who was the most important remaining insurgent leader. Wealthy Mexicans feared that Guerrero's election would encourage the poor to attack them, and they called his supporters anarchists. They disdained him for his racial background and rustic culture. Guerrero supporters argued that Gomez Pedraza was pro-Spanish, centralist, anti-patriotic, and aristocratic. Many people believe that there was an enormous amount of stake in this election. The actual election itself is a kind of paradox. The presidential election was in the hands of the state legislatures. Each state Congress would meet, and whoever received the most votes in that meeting would receive the one vote the state could cast. The actual selection of the next president was very far removed from the ordinary voters who formed the theoretical substrate of popular sovereignty. Despite this distance, the electoral campaign was extremely heated and emotional, and there was significant involvement on the part of ordinary Mexicans. The supporters of Gómez Pedraza and Guerrero clashed with each other in newspapers and pamphlets. They criticized the opposing candidates, they worked to influence state congressmen, and they accused their opponents of illegally pressuring the state congressmen. Local political and military leaders became very involved in the struggle. Gómez Pedraza won the election 9 states to 8 states. This did not end the conflict. The radicals had worked hard to convince many people that they had a voice in national politics and that using that voice could make a difference in their lives. The radical egalitarians had also undermined the legitimacy of their opponents by tying them to Spanish hostility toward Mexican independence. The months of armed demonstrations pressuring the state legislatures to expel the Spaniards had prepared the egalitarians for regime change outside of the electoral process. These demonstrations had convinced people that the Spaniards were a threat to Mexican independence and to their social aspirations, and that the demonstrations had shown them that politicians were more likely to listen to them when they were armed. It was a short step from there to actually overthrowing the government. Soon, a popular rebellion, supported by part-time militiamen in various regions, Afro-Mexican sharecroppers from both coasts, and the urban poor of Mexico City, put Vicente Guerrero into the presidency. For many Mexicans, the moment when Vicente Guerrero took office was a moment of social validation. Crowds thronged his inauguration, and the poor jostled each other to catch a glimpse of the ceremony. He identified with Mexicans whose skin was dark, and the feeling was mutual. The British traveler Mark Beaufoy, who was in Mexico in 1827, remarked that, quote, all the Indians and Sambos and darker races of the Creoles, comprising at least 8/10 of the nation, considered him as one of themselves and look up to him as their idol. When Beaufoy was traveling in the supposedly dangerous Tierra Caliente, locals told him that it was safe to, quote, do what you like, say what you like, go where you like, always remembering to praise Guerrero and curse the Spaniards. The very things that made wealthy Mexicans with light skins hate Guerrero's presidency made him popular with ordinary Mexicans. The wealthy felt like he was uncouth, but his manners were those typical of the way in which poor people showed each other courtesy and respect. One of Guerrero's opponents said that Guerrero as president would turn the presidential palace into a posada, a word used for the kind of humble inn that welcomed rural travelers of all social backgrounds. Yet the idea that they too were citizens who would be welcome in the national palace was one of the things that endeared him to ordinary Mexicans. Guerrero's inaugural address called for unity among all people born in Mexico, a formulation that excluded Spaniards. He also praised the new egalitarianism. He wrote that the mistaken application of free market principles had allowed foreign imports to flood Mexico, and he argued for protectionism to help workers whose jobs had been eliminated by foreign competition. In the rule of 1829, this was quite a radical statement for a powerful politician to make. Thinking globally, in France, the radical egalitarianism of the French Revolution had been apparently defeated by the reaction. The Haitian Revolution had destroyed slavery there, but by the 1820s, the political elite was working to reestablish the plantation system and restricting the social mobility of rural people. The Guerrero regime may have been the most radical regime to gain power, however temporary, anywhere in the 19th century world. Guerrero was actually in office less than a year before he was in turn overthrown by a coalition that combined professional military officers with the civilian supporters of hierarchy. The radical egalitarians did not cede their hard-won power graciously. They believed that Mexico's independence was still in peril and that the most conservative forces in Mexican politics were in league with Spain. They argued that their opponents wanted to restore the social and political structures of colonialism, with its centralized power and its racial hierarchy. For the radicals, independence mattered because it had decentralized power and eliminated racial distinctions. Perhaps their most eloquent expression of these ideas is found in the proclamation that the city council of Guadalajara issued after Vicente Guerrero was overthrown. They published their proclamation as a broadside suitable for distribution in the streets and posting on corners. The council argued that the men who had forced Guerrero from office were opponents of federalism. Up to this point, the document might be interpreted as evidence of a conflict between provincial elites desiring autonomy and the Mexico City elite desiring centralism. But soon the document pivots toward class and race. The councilmen describe their opponents as, quote, those sustainers of privileges and distinctions, those powerful rich guys or those aristocrats, enemies of equality and pretenders of titles and homages, those rascals that insist upon the differences between noble and plebeian, decent man or Spaniard, and black, Indian, mestizo, lobo, coyote, mulatto, and all the throng of animals with whose color our iniquitous dominators compared us. Here, like the independence leader Jose Maria Morelos had done 15 years before, they are referencing the array of racial categories depicted in the Costa paintings. The struggle was between wealthy aristocrats who wanted to reimpose official racial categories and the vast majority of Mexicans. As the councilman put it, their opponents were, quote, the vile aristocrats who want only the sword to dominate us and have judged merit in only the superficial distinction of a difference of color. The ensuing civil war was cut short when Guerrero was betrayed and executed, but the issues at its heart continued to be important for many years. Mexican politics in the 1820s can seem very odd to us. The compromise that ended the bloody War of Independence failed because Spain and the Bourbon monarchy were unwilling to participate, and the military officer made a temporarily successful effort to install himself as the constitutional monarch of Mexico. When Iturbide fell, regional elites insisted on a federalist and republican constitution. Mexicans organized political parties that were centered on Masonic lodges, and elections became raucous scenes. Mexico experienced an explosion of political publications and the efforts of foreign diplomats to advance their country's economic interests. There were coup attempts, armed petitions, and civil wars. The Spanish government backed a hopeless attempt to reconquer Mexico, and the few Spaniards who remained in the new republic became the focus of politics and the object of persecution. No wonder historians have struggled to provide coherent interpretations of this period. To explain the period, we need to consider how the participation of large numbers of relatively poor people shaped events. That participation was uneven. Not all poor rural and urban Mexicans became involved in elections, armed petitions, and civil wars. Still, their influence was crucial. Many of those ordinary Mexicans sought to preserve both Mexican independence and the egalitarianism that they saw as inseparable from it. At times, they sought solutions to their immediate economic problems. However, more consistently, they insisted upon racial equality, rejecting colonial racial categories. Their politics flowed from their lived experiences and the emotions those experiences provoked. The most salient and repeated political conflicts in Mexico during the decade after independence took place between wealthy people who saw themselves as white and less wealthy people who sought to reinforce egalitarianism in the new republic. These wealthy white people were deeply uncomfortable in a Mexico where poor and darker people believed themselves to be just as honorable and just as entitled to influence policy. The elite felt that their wealth and their social status were threatened, and sometimes they felt that their property and very lives were at stake. Many people of mixed race understood that they were still despised, despite the official norms making all men equal citizens. They worked to assert their rights and reinforce their new status, embracing egalitarianism, and sometimes working to expand it in new directions. Conflict was inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. If you want to um, close your share screen, so we can go back to.
Oh, okay. Here we go.
Thank you. Great. So, okay, so let's let's start with some question. If you have questions, please write them in the Q&A chat. Um, and let me see, we have here, okay, Q&A. Uh, there's no questions
Any
yet.
have come in yet. I'm sure we can come up with some.
I'm sorry?
Oh, looks like one did just come in.
Okay. Let's see. And this is from David Perez. And he's asking how much of Mexican independence is also a function of American Indian nationhood or sovereignty? Peter?
That's a really interesting question. The answer, for the most part, for this period of Mexican history, this is not something that most Mexican indigenous people are pushing toward. They're not pushing toward sovereignty. Different villages have a lot of autonomy during the colonial period, and they work to maintain that autonomy, through the 19th century and most recently in the 1990s, which has been a big thing for them. But this was not a huge part of the reason why they mobilized to fight for to fight the Mexican royal government during the 18 teens. No, it actually wasn't.
Okay. Okay. And you speak back on that, there's a lot of uh, speculation and stories about Vicente Guerrero also um, speaking Nahuatl and really mobilizing the indigenous population. And I wonder how that um, uh, shape his political view about the new nation and the status of not only Afro-Mexicans but indigenous communities, especially in that part of Mexico, the Nahua speaking.
Mhm. So he was from a Nahua-speaking area of Mexico, and people speculate he might have had indigenous relatives also. Okay, but he definitely had African ancestry. He worked in commerce as a muleteer, bringing things to indigenous communities and buying products in indigenous communities, and he uses Nahuatl pretty often with them. Right? There's a lot of signs that he was very cognitive of indigenous culture. For instance, when they force him out of the presidency, the way he says that he accepts this, he says, I'm going to give you I'm going to give up the baston de mando, which is like the vara that was the sign of indigenous leaders who led villages. Okay. Which is not something that typically a Spanish-speaking person would have said. For someone really working entirely in Hispanic political culture would have said, for instance. So he clearly had a lot of ties with indigenous communities, especially in the state, what's now the state of Guerrero, which is where he was from. But there were lots of people who reported that indigenous people in central Mexico also really saw him as kind of one of them, or at least someone who was going to protect them. And some writers wrote to that effect.
Great. Thank you. There's another question by Ed Tellis, and he's asking, how does the history impact Mexican American and Chicano culture, especially related to Afro-Mexicans?
That's also a really good question. Because generally speaking, when the Chicano movement sort of got started, in places like Los Angeles, right, in the 1960s and 70s, um, the sort of vision of Mexico that they took up was the vision of Mexico as an indigenous nation or as a mestizo nation, right? And for these people, the notion that there were Afro-Mexicans was not very, very high on their radar, right? And relatively few Afro-Mexicans actually immigrated to the U.S. until the 1980s and 1990s. And they mostly didn't go to the Southwest. They mostly went to places like North Carolina, and and there are obscure reasons for that. But that's where they established contacts, where they moved to. And so it had the notion that they have African ancestry has not, to my knowledge, been a part of Chicano activism in any kind of substantial way. And maybe it should be. It might facilitate certain kinds of alliances, for instance. Okay. Um,
Yeah.
so most people in Mexico, the what happens over the course of time is that in the colonial period they're using the racial categories and they classify people in racial category. And a lot of urban people are considered to have African ancestry, And then by the time they redo racial classification again, which is really the early 20th century, they start doing it under new forms of racism. These people have adopted the identity that they're mestizo, not that they're mulatto, right? And there's been a ton of intermarriage and all of this stuff. And so you can walk around urban Mexico and you know that there's a lot of people who have some African ancestry around you, but they don't really think about it much.
Very interesting. So Abraham Castillo is asking, how did these ideas about equality and the rejection of caste actually play out in more distant regions like Alta California, where people were far from the main centers of the independence movement?
I don't really know the answer to that, actually. I'm not really an expert in the history of Alta California. I read a lot about the 1840s at a certain point to write a book I was writing about the Mexican-American War, but I'm not really cognizant of what was going on in the late colonial period. And so I just don't know. Maybe somebody should write a book about that.
There you go, an idea for those of graduate students watching this webinar. Um, Meishu Liu is asking, today the Afro Mexican movement is relatively new. How did the identity, specifically of people of African descent who do not live in the southern areas where many still live, evolve over time? Or did they ever identify separately from other mixed race people, that is, white and indigenous?
So what happens is very interesting with beginning in the 18 teens with the War of Independence. They dropped the notion of their African ancestry. Okay, by the 1820s, it's almost impossible to find references to people who make a comment that they have African ancestry. Okay, they are among the first people to adopt the notion that everyone is Mexican, right? You're Mexican, I'm Mexican. It doesn't really matter. We're all Mexicans. Okay. They adopt nationalism, and I wrote an article about this years ago. They adopt nationalism practically before everybody else. The notion that they're going to be Mexican and not Afro-Mexican. And so what that makes really interesting is that it's really not until the 1980s and 1990s, even in these heavily Afro-Mexican places on the coast of Oaxaca and the coast of Guerrero and places like that, that they come back to, for a variety of reasons, starting to see themselves as Afro-Mexicans. Okay? And part of that is they see indigenous people adopting sort of, reinforcing their indigenous political identity, starting with the Zapatistas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But part of that is that anthropologists have been going in there for years and talking about their African roots, right? Which they had never really thought that much about, right? They knew they were not the same as the indigenous communities next to them, but they thought we're Mexican and they're Indian. And then they start to think, oh, well, yeah, we're Afro-Mexican and they're Indian. And so that movement really gets a lot of traction in the 90s and especially the early 2000s.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And even that is recognized with the changes in the Constitution, right? The third root, the mestizo, the indigenous, and now the Afro-Mexican actually is encoded now there in those changes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ruben Hernandez Leon, director of the Latin American Institute, says, thanks for an excellent talk, Peter. Do you think that the characterization of the 19th century as a century of chaos for Mexico is as a liberal elite is a liberal elite characterizations which reflects the subaltern acquiring too much power post-independence?
That sounds like something the late Bradford Burns, great UCLA historian, that's very much what he was arguing about 30 years ago. And I believe he's more than a little correct about that. Okay. So, when you're in the top of society, you look at things going on below you and they look like anarchy. To the people doing them, they don't look like anarchy. Like the fact that the rents that they could, John Tuzino has written about the fact that the rents that they could charge rural people dropped dramatically. Okay. It really changed the way they had to run their haciendas because they couldn't force people to pay really high rents anymore, right? Well, that's great from the point of view of the renters, right? It's terrible from the point of view of the landlord. There's a lot of that kind of thing that goes on. So what looks like chaos from the top is just sort of ordinary life and people exerting a little power at the bottom. I think that's a very accurate way to represent that.
Christian Ramirez is asking, my question for you is, how did Guerrero's ideals of egalitarianism later influence his successors like Juan Alvarez and to even later leaders in the region he was from, even up to Lucio Cabañas? Hmm.
Well, I don't know much about Lucio Cabañas. I do a little bit, but I know a lot about Juan Alvarez, though. And the answer is that they very much adopted these ideals. I mean, Juan Alvarez was, Guerrero was his idol, and he continued to fight for these things, and he actually reached the presidency for a short time himself in the 1850s. This is something that they took very seriously, partly because a lot of their political base was Afro-Mexicans who lived on the coast, right, of the coast of Guerrero. But also, I mean, Alvarez, definitely took this, very seriously involving indigenous people. And he was working for them too. Now, Lucio Cabañas, I know less about, but it seems like in some ways he's an extension of that political culture.
Okay, thank you. Audrey Harris is asking, can you say how Mexico's current wealth gap might be traced to the post-independence period? What would you have had to occur to create a more egalitarian socioeconomic system in Mexico?
Well, Audrey, I have news for you. For a class, I looked up the Gini coefficient, which is the typically most accepted economic measure of the disparity of wealth between the wealthy and the poor in the U.S. and Mexico. And Mexico is slightly more egalitarian now than the U.S. is in terms of the way wealth is distributed. I'm not sure, I've not looked into this too much. I think that Mexico catching up and passing us says a lot more about the hyper billionaires that the U.S. has acquired recently than it says about much changing in Mexico. Okay, so the wealth gap, Mexico's economy has been bedeviled by two different gaps. One is the one you're talking about between the very wealthy and the very poor, right, in Mexico, and which has persistently stayed more or less the same over the course of time. The other one is the gap between Mexico's GDP per capita and the U.S. GDP per capita, which has also consistently kind of stayed the same for a long period of time. What could they have done to deal with this wealth gap? I think that it's possible that a more thorough agrarian reform in the early 20th century would have helped significantly. But the thing that makes the wealth gap grow in the 20th century is it's not so much happening in rural areas as it's just so much as happening as the state has set up situations where industrialists can really prosper in Mexico. And that was a deliberate policy, the only way they felt they could industrialize Mexico, right? So I don't know what they could have done that could have kept this wealth gap from persisting all of these years. But I'm not an economist, although I did minor in economics in graduate school.
Thank you, Peter. Brian, go ahead, open your mic and ask your question.
Sure. Great presentation. Thank you so much. I'm sort of thinking in terms of the Americas as a whole and the way that liberalism played out on this, in this hemisphere. It was Emilia Viotti da Costa argued, at least the case of Brazil. I don't know if she argues it for all of Latin America or the Americas or just for Brazil, but what distinguishes Brazilian liberalism and I suppose also U.S. liberalism and Mexican liberalism from European liberalism is that rather than a confrontation between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, it's really between the aristocracy and the colonial power, right? At least that's what she argues about Brazil. And so she says that gives Brazilian liberalism a very different, flavor from European liberalism. And I think we kind of see the same thing in the U.S. too, right? There's so many of the checks and balances, that are established in the U.S. Constitution are really about keeping the popular classes in their place. And of course, there was an entire segments of the population that was completely left out of U.S. liberalism as well, which is the enslaved portion of the population. So I'm wondering, is Mexico really an example of a more successful liberalism, at least early on, in terms of, or at least that there being perhaps more, is there more popular resistance to elite attempts to co-opt liberalism, or are the elite less successful, at least initially in Mexico? How does Mexico compare, I guess, to the U.S., to Brazil, to the rest of the Americas in this regard?
So I would say that ordinary people kind of resisted that elite interpretation of liberalism very successfully in Mexico up until the 1860s, 1870s, and in the 1880s, they lost the battle. Okay. And it's really under Porfirio Diaz, with the massive influx of foreign capital and the creation of economic networks that connected Mexico very thoroughly to the Industrial Revolution, that kind of like, okay, liberalism is really about property rights and is really in the service of capitalism, becomes the predominant form of liberalism in Mexico. But in this period that I mostly work on, which is before that, people are pretty successful at resisting that. Okay, at adopting it to do different things for them, making it work for them in their daily lives, and making the rhetoric work for them for their political aspirations. Now, what happens when Diaz was able to make this shift? It's not just him; it's a lot of things happening making this happen. Is that for the most part, ordinary Mexicans continue to embrace liberalism as a political ideology. Even the Mexican anarchists call themselves the Mexican Liberal Party, right? And they continue to embrace these ideals of liberalism, things like local autonomy, right? Things like popular suffrage, working toward having free elections, all of those kinds of things. But they no longer have the kind of really strong alliances with the elite that can let them put their point of view across consistently, right? But even if you look at, Emiliano Zapata, the Plan de Ayala, in the middle of the Mexican Revolution, talking about a land reform, the rhetoric of it is intensely liberal. Intensely liberal. In fact, he cites the Constitution of 1857. So that liberalism still is important in people's ideas about politics, at the top and the bottom, but the view at the top is what's actually kind of persisting.
Fascinating. Thank you. Diane Ross asks, to what degree did discussion of equal rights of Blacks, end of slavery, etc., in Mexico, and the leadership of Vicente Guerrero have an effect on discussions in the U.S., including the Mexican-American War?
That's a really interesting question. I do not know of U.S. abolitionists who knew much about what was going on in Mexico. Okay, and maybe that's just I haven't read the right people. Mexican travelers in the U.S. Like to compare themselves to the U.S. and say, look at the U.S. They talk about liberty, and they're holding slaves. They're holding a lot of slaves. Okay, and they definitely like to talk about that. And many American slaves escaped over the border to Mexico. And I saw instances when I was writing about the Mexican-American War, where U.S. soldiers would run into this former slave in Mexico, and they were surprised to see he had married an ordinary Mexican woman, he had children, he was running a business, and then no one thought too much about this. Okay, one of the most poignant things I ran across in that research ever. This was something that took place in the early 1840s, before the war, in San Luis Potosí, which is about 6 hours by car from the Texas border. There was a circus, American circus in New Orleans that had traveled to San Luis Potosí, and they were a circus that did horse tricks, right? All kinds of fancy horse riding. And there was a little boy in the circus who was one of the best riders, and he ran away from the circus. He ran away to the circus. He ran away from the circus. He was an African-American kid who was a slave. And he knew that he was in Mexico making money for these people who ran the circus, and he wasn't having it. He ran away, turned himself into the authorities, said, these people, I'm a slave and slavery is illegal here, right? And then there was a lot of correspondence with the American diplomatic coordinator, et cetera, about the people around the church kept saying, no, 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 he's our adopted son. He kept saying, no, 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 you enslaved me, right? And they placed him with an elderly Mexican couple, and then eventually the file stopped, which I assume meant that the circus left town and they left him behind, right? So there's certainly a lot of this sort of notion that things in Mexico are very different from things in the U.S. and American slaves definitely know that. They looked across the border if they possibly can. Our notion of like the Underground Railroad is people moving up through the northern U.S. and trying to get to Canada, right? The North Star, all of that. And that definitely was going on. But there was a big flow of slaves through the South out into Mexico. And that's a story that a few people have written about in recent years, but they haven't found any kind of organized people helping them. There's no like Underground Railroad like there was going north.
Thank you, Peter. There's another question by Ed Tellis, who says, Mexico reminds me of Brazil. They remove racial categories officially, but it seems in real life, when looking at the novellas, leadership position, etc., it didn't do what was expected, and racism will still continue. Any comments?
I will comment only on the phrase "what was expected," right? I think different people had different expectations about what removing the racial categories would do, right? People at the top were not going to give up their notion they were superior to everybody else because they were white. People at the bottom, though, were thinking, well, this will allow us a kind of social mobility that we didn't have before, right? So there's an old Latin American saying that money whitens, right? The notion that people people of darker skin who have more money can eventually climb socially and perhaps pass themselves off as having some other kind of ancestry. Okay. Um, um, that was a lot harder than the phrase would suggest, right? But it definitely became easier to do that after racial categories ended, right? But the prejudice persists, and even in Mexico, even today, okay, you do not see many wealthy people with very dark skins. Okay, you just don't. Okay, you don't see many politicians in national office with very dark skins. You just don't. Okay, and there's definitely a very conscious racism, and there's still microaggressions on the streets against people who have a lot of indigenous ancestry, definitely, and against people perceived as having African ancestry.
Thank you. Can you share a little bit with us what was the political education of Vicente Guerrero? Where is he? How is he getting these ideas about racial equality? Is he in dialogue with larger group, other movements at the period? What can you tell us about that?
So he joins the rebellion against the Spanish, and at that point, the rebellion is led by priests, right? Hidalgo, and then later Morelos, who Guerrero works very closely with. Morelos was also Afro-Mexican, right? He very clearly was, okay, and that was actually preventing him from rising much in the hierarchy. Kept getting assigned to parishes with in very hot areas with very poor disease conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And for those people, the notion that they work from is the notion that everybody comes from Adam, right? We're all in some sense descendants of Adam, right? Going back to the Garden of Eden, and this racial thing basically makes no sense. Okay. There's not like they're looking to Haiti. It's not like they're looking to the French Revolution. But there's another source for this sense that all people should be treated equally racially, and that's one that I talked a little bit about during my talk, which is that it seems to have been a very common attitude among poor Mexicans. You can tell they married across all these racial barriers. They chose godparents from across all these racial barriers, right? They went into business people across all these racial barriers. They definitely believed that a person's worth came from what they did, their behavior, right? If you were pious, if you worked hard, if you were honest and honorable, then you were okay from their point of view. Okay, and I suspect that that's something that really was a very important thing for Guerrero. Supposedly, the legends are that he treated everybody who crossed his path with respect. Okay, can you prove that from a distance of 200 years? No, you can't really prove that. Okay, but that's what people kept saying about him. So one of the examples is that a ball was held in his honor when he was president. Okay, and this comes from one of his critics, Bustamante. One of his critics, who I quoted, Carlos Maria de Bustamante, said, making fun of him, he didn't even want to sit in the seat of honor at this ball because he said he was no better than anybody else. And Bustamante is making fun of him for saying this, but it makes sense with all the other things that we know about this guy.
Yeah. Thank you. And for your closing remarks, I'm going to combine these last two questions, so maybe you can address them.
Okay.
Diane Ross asked, the power of the church was much weakened during this period. Did it take an official position on the race issue, on the one hand? And on the other, the second question is by David Perez. Did Francisco de Sabreda comment about the new Spain about this period and even perhaps alluded to the future independence?
Okay, I didn't quite catch the second one. Can you repeat the second one?
Did Francisco de Sabreda comment about New Spain, about this period, and even perhaps allude to future independence?
I don't know the answer to the second question. I don't know the answer to the second question. I do know the answer to the first question, which was the church, a law was passed saying you can't even put people's racial categories in the books of baptisms and marriages. The church does not protest at all that. Okay. The bishops seem to be very on board with this. It causes them trouble, though, not because of Afro-Mexicans, but because of indigenous Mexicans, because typically indigenous Mexicans were paid for their religious services a different way than other people paid for them. Indigenous communities would make they'd make an agreement with the local priest under which they were going to give them a little bit of cash, they were going to give him food, and they were going to give him a rotating cast of young couples to do domestic service, to do his take care of his animals and do his cooking and stuff like that. That becomes very controversial when everybody's equal because the young couples are saying everybody's equal. We don't have to do this anymore, and so many priests are very worried about that.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Professor Guardino, for a wonderful presentation. Thank you for all the participants. Please help me welcome Professor Guardino for a wonderful presentation. And we're going to conclude now. Thank you for your presentation, Peter.